Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Pretty Creepy Podcast, Episode 2. That's right, we're keeping it going. We're back with some more, but this time, we're not in the realm of fiction. We're in reality. Stuff that's actually happened.
Boom, boom, boom.
I'm your host today, Lucas, joined by everyone else.
Craig Taylor.
And I am Matt, the warlock of the Dark Plane, guiding you through the adventure tonight.
Literally plain for your
We'll get there.
Okay. Oh, yes. Right over the warlock's head.
This might be a quick episode because we're due back in the pits of hell soon.
Yes, yeah.
All right, boys. I'm going to get us rolling here. I got a good story that I recently found. This was actually going to be my throwaway story, and shit got wild. So I was like, the people need to hear this. So, set the scene. Back in 1986, there was a 16-year-old girl named Annie Andrews who received a phone call from a boy she had never met, claiming to be a friend of a friend. He described himself as a tall, blonde, athletic boy named Danny. He eventually nagged her into agreeing to go on a date. So they meet up in real life, and he looked nothing like his description, but they still went on the date anyway. They went for some ice cream, and Danny started displaying odd behavior and asking inappropriate questions after learning Annie's mom passed away recently. So Annie called the date early. She went home, decided she was not going to talk to Danny anymore. A few days later, Annie and her sister Jessica had a seance in her basement, and nothing strange occurred. Later that night, however, both sisters claimed they heard a knocking on their walls and wondered if it was from a spirit trying to contact them. The knocking would take place then at all hours of the day and night, constantly waking the girls from sleeping and scaring them. Suddenly, items began disappearing and reappearing in different locations in their house, most notably their bedroom. Annie and Jessica's father, Brian, did not believe the house was haunted, as he did not believe in any ghosts at all. He did not experience any of the same phenomena the girls reported.
He's like the main character in the horror movie.
Oh yeah, pretty much. I don't believe it. He attributed it to their overactive imaginations and the fact that their mother had passed recently. So 1987, a year at this point, the girls heard a strange sound coming from the basement and went to investigate. What they found was a message written in blood on the wall that said, "I'm in your room, come find me." The girls ran from their house in search of a neighbor who could alert their dad. Brian came home and discovered the words had in fact been written in ketchup, hopefully Heinz, not blood, and assumed this was just the girls' cry for attention. The noises stopped for a little bit, but eventually another message appeared, this time in Annie's bedroom saying, "I'm back, find me if you can." Once again, a neighbor called Brian. When he had turned home, he walked up a set of stairs, found another message written on the wall in ketchup saying, "Marry me." He entered the room, and standing there was a teenage boy dressed up as his deceased wife, wearing a blonde wig and face paint. He was holding a hatchet and tried to advance, so Brian turned around and ran outside. The police were immediately called. They come in, the police conduct a search of the entire house, but were unable to locate the boy, who had seemingly vanished. One officer noticed a gap between a wall and a built-in cabinet in Annie's bedroom. They pulled the cabinet away and found Danny crouched in the crawl space behind the cabinet. After a further investigation of the crawl space, it revealed he had been hiding within the walls of their home for weeks, if not a year, so far that he carved peepholes to watch the family. Danny was taken immediately into police custody and held in a juvenile detention facility until October 1987, when he was released for being a minor. On December 1st, 1987, a man named Andrew Gustafson came home and found his pregnant wife and 2 young children murdered in his home. Police quickly suspected Danny and found evidence of the crimes at his house. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences, and in 2013, his full name, Daniel LaPlante, sued the state of Massachusetts for denying him access to supplies needed for the practice of Wicca, saying he needed to ward off jinx and contact the goddesses. He petitioned for parole in 2019, but was denied and resentenced without the possibility of parole for showing little remorse for his actions. So, how do you feel about the guy living in your wall, Matt?
I hear him knocking.
Is
Right now.
there a name for that, or is they just like?
That's like a straight news report.
Well, I just mean, do they call it like a name for him, or because I've never heard of that?
His name's just Danny LaPlante.
Oh, so just like,
Yeah,
he
he
doesn't
doesn't
have like a
have-
cool name
No,
or
he doesn't
anything.
have like a name or anything. What actually happened is I read a different story about a robber who would rob McDonald's, but instead of walking in the front
Ron
door,
McDonald. Sorry.
but instead of walking in the front door, the guy would rappel down from the ceiling in McDonald's and rob them. What is the tactical advantage to that? But that got me thinking. I was like, you know, you hear horror stories of like people living in people's walls, and I was like, there has to be like some killers that have lived in people's walls, and that's what I was like, this got to be a filler story. And then it got wild, man.
Yeah, I mean, I think that plus would they be considered squatters?
I guess at that point,
Because you
If
can't even get them out.
If you live somewhere for 3 months, aren't you considered a resident also by like PA law?
I don't know what PA squatting laws. I just see like horror stories of squatting laws. You know, landlords complaining on TikTok, and believe me, I cry every night thinking about those poor landlords. But they're like, this person, I call the police and I can't evict them. So
Isn't that weird though that you could just be living in a house? And I've heard it happen in apartment complexes before, where there's like space in between the different apartment rooms, and people would live back there. I mean, did you ever watch the '90s Candyman? He like lived in the walls in between the apartments and in an abandoned apartment. I mean, it's happened a bunch of times in
That's
real life.
wild.
Yeah, and that's creepy that someone could just be behind your walls. There's like plenty of police reports and stories about people doing it too. Like it's
Yeah.
more common than you think.
gotta check my walls, my apartment.
What do you even do at that point?
Yeah, I mean, there's got to be like food missing, and I feel like you start to notice stuff if that is really what's happening.
Yeah, I think that's the more recent one that I read about too, where like some guy lived in someone's wall and they kept noticing food missing from the pantry and stuff, and that's how they discovered him. And like, so he wasn't violent, I guess, but still creepy to think someone else is sleeping in your house.
True.
All right, Craig, go ahead, lead us in.
Okay. So my two stories, we'll just do one at a time, but they have an unintentional Japanese theme. I wanted to do something that maybe isn't as common as like other types of like true crime or whatever. So, but if you're kind of in like a, I don't know what you'd call it, not the dark web, but people that are really into true crime and stuff like that, I see these on icebergs all the time of like, fucked up stories or whatever. So first one is about a man named Isai Sagawa, who goes by the name of Pang or the Kobe Cannibal. So he was born to a wealthy family and was the son of the president of a water company. As a child, he was frail and introverted, and in the first grade, he started to experience cannibalistic desires after seeing an exposed male thigh.
That's young.
Yeah, according to because we'll get to that, but a lot of this stuff is according to him, and this eventually progressed to bestiality with his family dog, and cannibalistic desires for women as well. So the women get it too.
Poor dog.
Doesn't eat the dog. He just right. And if I'm the dog, I found a choice.
I'd rather be eaten.
Okay, well, I guess that's fair.
I don't know. He might be a good lover.
Yeah. So, when he was a university student at the age of 24, he followed a foreign woman home, broke into her apartment with a plan to slice her butt off and sneak away with it. The woman fought back, and he was charged with.
Sorry. I'm laughing at the phrasing.
This is the Pretty Creepy podcast, not the Pretty Funny podcast.
I know. I'm sorry. The phrasing sliced her butt
Some
off.
guy just walking with a whole butt.
Well, the Wikipedia entry called it sliced her buttocks off, which I thought was even funnier.
I was just thinking of like a little kid, like with a sword. I'm gonna slice your butt off.
And this guy followed through.
Okay, I'm sorry. So
Well, he didn't actually fall through in this case. So she fought back and was charged with attempted rape. The case was dropped after his family paid a settlement. When he was 27, he moved to Paris to pursue a PhD in literature. And he says that nearly every night he would bring a prostitute home and try to bring up the courage to try to shoot her and to eat her, but he could never do it. And then at 32, he committed his most infamous crime. So this is all a direct quote from Wikipedia, which I borderline plagiarized my entire notes from Wikipedia. So thank you, whoever wrote that. But this is a direct quote because I thought it capsulized it very well. So On June 11th, 1981, Sagawa invited his Sorbonne, I guess that's the college they went to, classmate Renee Hartevelt, a Dutch woman, to dinner at his apartment under the pretext of translating poetry for a school assignment. Sagawa planned to kill and eat her, having selected her for her health and beauty, which were characteristics that he felt that he lacked. Sagawa considered himself weak, ugly, and small because he was actually born premature, and so he kind of wanted to absorb her energy. She was 25 years old and 5'10", I guess, height and weight. After Hartevelt arrived, she began reading poetry at a desk with her back to Sagawa when he shot her in the neck with a rifle. Sagawa said that he fainted after the shock of shooting her, but awoke with the realization that he had to carry out his plan and couldn't, go back. He then had sex with her corpse, but he could not bite into her skin because his teeth were not sharp enough. So he left the apartment and purchased a butcher knife. Sagawa consumed various parts of her body, eating most of her breasts and face either raw or cooked, while saving other parts in his refrigerator. He also took photographs of Hartevelt's body at each eating stage. He then attempted to dump the remains in Hartevelt's corpse in a lake in, I don't know how to pronounce this, some lake in France, and carrying her dismembered body parts in 2 suitcases, but was caught in the act and arrested by French police 4 days later. Now, if any of you sick fucks watching, and I know you're out there, want to know what her body looked like, it is on YouTube.
Oh my God.
Oh. And I unintentionally saw it. So if you really want to find it, it is out there. I don't recommend it. It's very gross.
Yeah. What's really gross, most notorious crime scenes and stuff, the pictures are like readily available if you got like the stomach to look at them.
Yeah, I feel like if I was younger, I would be eating it up because that's what you do when you're young.
Yeah, when you're
look
young,
up
you
sick,
want to
fucked up
see all the
pictures.
weird, shocking stuff.
And what was frustrating about that is it's in a Vice interview with him, which I wanted to watch because I've heard about the interview with him because it's pretty famous. Because he's very candid and it's just kind of interesting hearing him talk. And he drew, which we'll get to, a manga about his crime, and they were censoring the manga of like what he was doing, like with the body. So I was like, oh, okay, because whenever you click on the video, there's a little warning. I'm like, oh, it's probably just because what he's describing is graphic, and no, that's not what they're talking about. So yeah, it was an unpleasant surprise. When I was researching.
Is this guy in jail?
Well, that's what's great.
Oh
so
my God.
He was found legally insane in France and unfit to stand trial, and was sentenced to be held in a mental institution. And after an author wrote a book about his crimes, he did gain some celebrity and was eventually deported back to Japan. And he was then committed to a mental hospital in Japan, although Japanese psychologists declared him not legally insane and just said he was perverted and that his crimes were committed because of like sexual desire and not because he was insane.
Well, if he's not insane, that would make him fit for trial at that point.
Yeah.
Well, you would think so. But then the charges in France were dropped and the court documents, I guess because he was deported, were still sealed and not released to Japanese authorities. And therefore, the Japanese could not legally detain him. So he remains a free man to this day. So that's sort of why people would, he gets all his interviews and this notoriety. He's become somewhat of a celebrity in Japan, although he obviously couldn't find serious work because of his notorious past. He made some money. As I said, he made a manga talking about his killing and illustrating it. He even starred in like softcore pornos where he would like bite actors because he's like a cannibal. And he has appeared on talk shows and things like that. So he remains unrepentant and says that he only plans to do it. He plans to do it again, and says that his only regret is that he didn't eat her while she was still alive.
So check your walls tonight.
Yeah. Now, with some other things, I obviously didn't watch the interview fully because I was grossed out. But some of the things he talks about is how for him, he doesn't understand. Like it's so tied to his sexual arousal that he doesn't understand why normal couples don't want to eat each other. That's like just how he views it.
That's got to be something like if you're that insane, some wires.
Not in Japan.
Yeah, okay. If you're that, whatever they classify, like wires have to get crossed pretty young. Like, there has to be like some traumatic event or something that like set this off in his life.
No, because I think in his backstory, he came from a very wealthy family. He was born premature, so it could have been that he just came out of the oven not right. But as far as he said, there was never one moment where he was like molested or anything like that you would think.
How does like this guy just walk around
I know,
and get
how
like
does he
interviews
get out?
and like star in things like, hey, you want to come and I'm gonna do it again?
Yeah, he just gets out. He just gets out of all of it by like some weird, crazy loopholes. Like,
Yeah.
that's so.
So does they like? There has to be like investigators or something that follow him. Like, I'm gonna do it again. Isn't that like enough grounds for investigation? Like,
Maybe.
that's the same as like saying, like hypothetically, if you just went like you said, like I'm going to kill someone.
Yeah,
like that
right.
would be grounds for investigation, right?
Well,
Yeah.
now he's so old. He apparently can't take care of himself. He has like family do it.
Does that make you like? Would that make everyone rest easier if he's just so old that like he can't do anything anymore?
Maybe, but he needs like continued care, and he obviously can't make money for himself because no one's gonna.
When was this? Like 80s,
his
90s.
crime probably 80s because all kinds of crazy shit.
That's like
happened
the
then.
80s is whenever-
1981 was
yeah.
when he, did that
That's
initial.
when everything crazy happened. People were living in walls. People were eating each other.
Yeah, it's actually interesting in Japan, and I'll get to this a little bit more in my next story, which is even worse. But that there was this fear of Americanism, I think they called it, in Japan, where they thought the crime wave and all the fucked up shit happening in the U.S. in the 80s was going to make its way to Japan. So it kind of was like this American, like if you think of the 80s, was like all kinds of crazy shit happened. There was a fear that was going to spread to other countries.
But I guess it went to France instead.
Yeah, it's skipped over. So, but yeah, an
hold
interesting guy.
your breath, Japan, because it's just coming the other way around the globe. It's,
Yeah.
it's getting to you soon. It's crossing through the Kazakh right now as we speak.
Man, people are nuts. Dare I even say, people are bonkers, man.
Yeah, let's see. Matt has an even crazier story.
But, people do be wild.
Yeah.
So, Lucas said, let's get some real events in here. And I just got so drawn in down the rabbit hole of this one particular story. And so it is not a horror story. No one gets eaten in it. Nobody's living in the walls. But it is a cool little mystery of history. It's actually pretty famous.
That rhymed.
So, I just got pulled down the rabbit hole and I was like, this is going to be what I talk about. So it's only creepy in the sense that it is an unresolved mystery.
And there is a creepy element. Like when I learned about it, is like vaguely kind of creepy.
Yeah, it is kind of creepy. So this is the story of D.B. Cooper, which you guys may have heard of before. So November 24th, 1971. As we say before, all the crazy shit in the last episode happening in the 70s. This episode is the 80s. We're back to the 70s. November 24th, 1971. So, a man by the name of Dan Cooper purchases a ticket for a flight from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington. He sits down and he orders a 7-Up and bourbon. After he gets on the plane, puts some sunglasses on. He's wearing a black suit, a black tie. Sips on his drink, smokes a cigarette because it's the 70s.
I was going to say, pulls out a cigarette.
Once he finishes his drink, he turns to the flight attendant behind him and slips her a note. What's funny is she didn't read the note. She put it in her pocket and thanked him. She's probably so used to guys hitting on her or something like that.
It was the 80s. They couldn't do anything.
70s.
Or 70s, sorry.
Even yeah.
Even worse.
DB Cooper, the man in the sunglasses and the bourbon, then told her, I don't have the exact quote here, but he said, "It's urgent. You might want to read that." He said, "You should read that note. I have a bomb." That's what he said. So
That's urgent.
she comes over to his seat.
Oh.
And he's got a briefcase on his lap. And he unfolds the briefcase just enough so that she can see 8 sticks of dynamite sitting inside this briefcase.
Not to interrupt, but if you think about airport security now. I understand
Oh,
this
yeah.
was well before 9/11. How the fuck are you able to get on a plane with a Looney Tunes like suitcase full of dynamite?
You just were able to bring on whatever, I guess.
Dynamite is like a Looney Tunes weapon too. Like
Yeah.
you know, you're like, "Tss." In a minute and 20 seconds, you're all going to be real sad.
Yeah, I know.
Kind of like the long wick on it.
So
long fuse.
the man during the flight demanded that once they reach Seattle, the government needed to give him $200,000 in cash, and he specified in $20 bills. They needed to provide him with 4 parachutes, and they needed to refuel the plane. And he specifically used the phrase, "no funny business." So they land in Seattle, and he gets everything he needs. Bags of money, parachutes. They refuel the plane, and he lets all the passengers off, but keeps the flight crew on the plane. He didn't know how to fly the plane, apparently. So he's plotting out with the pilot, and he tells the pilot, "I need you to take me to Mexico City. Fly to Mexico City." Pilot informs him that I cannot make it from Seattle, Washington to Mexico City without stopping to refuel. So after batting around a couple of locations to stop at, they decide to settle on Reno, Nevada. They're going to stop in Reno, Nevada, refuel, and then take off again and make their way to Mexico City. At this point, FBI is all over this. The military's on it. There's 2 fighter jets flanking this plane, which, by the way, is a Boeing 727 aircraft, similar to a military aircraft of the time. During the flight over, I can't remember if it's over Utah or Nevada, but he eventually, they assume, I mean, he had to have jumped out of the craft, basically. So what happens is there's a rear, like, set of steps in the back of the plane that you can drop down. And he was back there with a flight attendant, and, you know, she talked to him a little bit, and she asked why he was doing this. And all he said was that he said, "I'm not mad at your airline. I don't have a grudge with your airline, but I do have a grudge." Is what he said. So he tells her, "You might want to go up front now." So she goes up front, and she is the last person to have seen the man now known as D.B. Cooper. When they eventually went back, they noticed that the stairway was open, and he and all of the money was gone, as well as 2 of the 4 parachutes. Now, he requested 4 because this was a way to convince the FBI or leave them unsure that he might take hostages with him, like out of the aircraft. And the FBI, sure enough, said they did consider giving him dud parachutes, which is what they would have done if he had just asked for like 1. But instead, they decided to give him 4 functional ones. However, in the race to get him the parachutes, there was a mix-up, and they did end up giving him 1 dummy parachute that was used for like training exercises.
What training exercise?
Or you know, I don't know.
Yeah.
But they
Better pick the right one.
they did end up giving him 1 dummy parachute. He took 2 parachutes of the 4. One of the parachutes he took was the dummy parachute. So we'll get to that in a little bit. People assume he must have jumped out of the back of the plane. It was the middle of the night. He's in either Nevada or Utah, and the place they jumped out over was all woodland areas. And this is November, so it's snowy, it's cold, it's not good conditions. And the last anybody saw of this man, he's wearing loafers and a big trench coat over like a suit. And the only thing left of him after he leapt out of the plane with the money is he apparently had a clip-on tie, a black clip-on tie. He took it off and left it on the plane. So, parachutes out. The authorities do a big scan of this area, but the problem is the fighter jets did not see exactly where he jumped out at. So you have a potential area that he jumped of hundreds of miles. And then if you take into account the drifting on where he could have possibly landed, it's a really big area. And so they're searching everywhere, but he's never found. So they get artist descriptions from all the flight attendants because they got a good chance to look at him. And the D.B. Cooper sketch drawing is one of the most famous. It's sort of an iconic image of, FBI unsolved crime cases. It's because he's just a guy. It's such a detailed drawing. Lucas will,
That could be any white dude in the 70s.
I've definitely seen that.
Lucas will throw it up on screen for you guys.
That'd be kind of a sick tattoo.
Yeah. Now,
That's actually not a bad idea. Yeah.
what height is this plane flying at? Because if you're full 35,000 feet, you're dying like as soon as you
I'm
jump
glad
out.
you asked me that. He had a series of weird specific demands, some of which the pilot could meet and some of which he couldn't. But one of the demands was to keep it below 10,000 feet in the air. So presumably so he wouldn't freeze on his way down, maybe.
There's no oxygen up at that point too.
Mm-hmm.
So the first time I'd heard about this was actually I used to watch this on Netflix, is Brad Meltzer's Decoded.
Oh.
And this was probably 10 years ago at this point. I watched the episode, but I thought it was really interesting. I think one of the things that they say, because on that show they try to solve stuff like this, was that he was probably somebody in law enforcement, or at least familiar with it, because there's a lot of very specific things that, like, the average person is not going to think about having 4 parachutes. I assume $20 bills are not as suspicious as like $100 bills.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff, especially somebody in the 70s with access to the internet would have to be very knowledgeable about how to pull off a crime and in order to think of all that stuff, because the average person, there's no way.
So what gets interesting is they never find him. Okay. The money they gave him, I didn't know until I read about this case. Apparently, federal banks will keep money set aside specifically as ransom money because, every now and again they get some crazy guy demanding a ton of money, or he's going to kill some people or whatever. And so all of the money they gave him is all like cataloged bills. All the serial numbers are cataloged. So as soon as one of them turns up, like, it's going to hit, it's going to match. Like, the government can track this money. None of the money ever turns up until about 10 years later, 1980. I think it's 1980 or 1981. I only had today to research this, and this is one of the most like researched frickin' non-closed cases. So I'm not going to get to every detail, but essentially what happened was a family was vacationing to Washington. Okay. And let's see if I can find it. Yeah. 1980. So a small portion of the ransom money was found along the banks of the Columbia River in this beachhead known as the Tena beachhead. A little kid was there with his family, and he was digging, on this little piece of beach, and he finds this bag of disintegrated money.
And they arrest the kid, case closed.
Yes, they're like, "You're D.B. Cooper." He brings the bag to his parents. The parents have heard about this crime because it's a national news thing at this point. Where is this guy? And the FBI determines this is money from the thing. It's $5,000 of the $200,000. And the interesting thing is, they don't know how it got there. They don't know, because it's possible it could have been washed downriver, but the current of that river flows the other way from that shore. They did sediment analysis because there was a project done on that beachhead where they moved sediment from one place onto that beachhead. So it's buried underneath a few layers of clay. So they're trying to determine, was this put here before the new sediment was shipped in or afterward? originally they say, well, it had to be put here before, but then later scientists are like, no, actually that was natural clay that it was underneath. So it was put here afterward. So nobody knows. Nobody knows how it got there. One interesting piece of evidence, though, to suggest that it was buried is that they looked at the gum bands on the wads of cash. They were all still intact, and they determined that the material of those gum bands could not survive, would not keep its integrity for more than a year or two out in the natural environments. So they theorized somebody had to have buried this money in that spot to protect it from the elements because all the gum bands were intact.
We're also states away at this point, and they don't even know if it was him that buried it. So
Yeah.
they could discover that, oh, this money was buried, but it gets them no closer
Well,
to closing this case.
and that's what it is okay, so did DB Cooper bury it here, or did somebody find this money and bury it there, if it was buried at all? Or is it just a freak thing, like it got buried somehow by this river and, through natural causes?
I wonder what happened to his cigarette.
So interestingly enough, Craig, he smoked 8 cigarettes while he was on the plane. And he left 8. The only physical evidence they have of Dan Cooper is 8 cigarette butts and a small fleck of something on his tie clip. They have no idea if the DNA on the tie clip it matches him or if it's from somebody else.
Because you think he knew it? That people in even like law enforcement understood DNA to that level back then.
And the cigarette butts, unfortunately, probably the best chance of getting his actual DNA, somehow have been lost over the years or misplaced. How that happens,
Sounds like an inside job to
do
me.
not know. So this is interesting. There have been...
You in there?
By the way, I should mention before I go on that DB Cooper is actually an improper name. His name is Dan Cooper, which they think is almost certainly a pseudonym that he used to buy the plane ticket. One of the suspects was a man who lived in the area who's a grade school teacher named DB Cooper. And they investigated him and quickly found him to be innocent. He had an alibi and everything.
So they thought.
Imagine this crime happens and Matt Davis is just like, oh no.
A reporter made a mistake on their report. And so in national news, he sort of became known as DB Cooper, which sounds a lot cooler than Dan Cooper. And that has been what has stuck throughout the ages. I could get into all the suspects because they are fascinating. Thousands of people, this was a quote from the FBI, thousands of people have come out on their deathbeds saying that they were actually DB Cooper.
If you're about to die, that's so fucking funny.
TV Cooper.
I only want to cover one suspect and then I will get into theories so we can wrap it up because I know this is a long story. You can read so much more about it. The most interesting suspect, in my opinion, is a man named Richard Mccoy Jr. So Richard McCoy basically in April of 1972 robs another Boeing. He pulls off basically the same thing. He claims to have a grenade. It's a Boeing 727. He does the same exact thing. They land. He gets $500,000 in cash, requests 4 parachutes, and then ends up, jumping out the back. Well, they do end up finding this guy and arresting him, and he looks pretty similar to the drawing of DB Cooper, and this guy is a professional skydiver. However, they did end up crossing him off the list because there was mismatches in age. The description everybody gave was that DB Cooper was a man in his 40s, where McCoy would have only been in his 20s at the time of this, hijacking. And McCoy possessed a skydiving skill well above DB Cooper's thought skydiving skill. And there's credible evidence that McCoy was in Las Vegas on the day of the Portland hijacking. So I just thought he was the most interesting, but there's like a million cool suspects ranging from like former Green Berets to like people who came out on their deathbed who have a lot of interesting coincidences, but all of them have ultimately been debunked by the CIA.
Meanwhile, there's a skeleton wearing a backpack in the desert somewhere.
So
How lame would it be if he just died?
well,
Like-
that is pretty much the FBI's most working theory. I mean, officially it is a closed case at this point, and it's considered unsolved.
Cold case files.
But I mean, they kept it open for 45 years, and it's got a mountain of evidence.
Is that long enough that they just go like, all right, if you got away with it,
Well,
congratulations. 45 years, you made it.
Here's the thing: they never found the guy. They never found anybody who they thought could be this guy, and they never found any of the money except for that bag that kid found buried somewhere. And so the most plausible theory that a lot of law enforcement think, he jumped out in the middle of the night. It's the middle of winter, and he's jumping out into the forest. And so a lot of people think he just died, probably, and that he wasn't actually, because initially they thought this guy has to be ex-military, like a paratrooper or something. But later they began to think, because he's just wearing like loafers and a trench coat, and judging by he didn't know exactly where to go, he didn't know the air traffic lanes.
I was going to ask, is that why they suspect he wasn't like a skilled skydiver?
Yeah, and also that he took the dummy chute. Now, some people argue that he used the dummy chute to help like hold the money in place or something, like to help pack the money up. But other people think maybe he put the dummy chute on because he didn't know that he wasn't a skilled enough skydiver to know that was a dummy chute. So either way, the outfit is a big giveaway to some people too. He didn't have any skydiving equipment. That Henry McCoy guy had skydiving equipment, like helmets and goggles and things. And DB Cooper's jumping out the plane all he did was take his tie clip off. He's in a suit, a trench coat, and loafers. And even if he did land, he's in the middle of the woods in the middle of winter. And who knows how far he is from any kind of civilization at that point.
The other dude's walking on a plane in a skydiving outfit, and the flight attendant's like, okay, hold on.
The fact that they never found him, and the fact that none of the money has ever turned up aside from that bag, leads a lot of people to think he's just dead. Like, he jumped out of that plane and he died. And it's like you said, Lucas, there's a skeleton in the middle of the forest holding a bag of money somewhere. But the other popular conspiracy theory, of course, is that it was some sort of inside job within the airlines, like an employee that worked there and knew how to get out of it. Or, of course, that he was, you always got to turn to the CIA, right? Always easy to say, maybe it was the CIA trying to get some, off the record money. But the more and more evidence they piled up, the more and more it seems that DB Cooper actually was mostly winging this thing and didn't know that much about skydiving. So they think he might just be dead.
Sometimes in life, the simplest explanation is the correct one.
Yeah.
Or he's sitting on a beach in Mexico sipping a pina colada.
He did want to go to Mexico City. Now, who knows if that was his final intended destination, or
I think that was just in his mind, out of like the U.S. If the jets were following him, don't they lose jurisdiction over the border?
Probably.
So they'd have to turn back.
He bailed out in the Pacific Northwest, so he had a long freaking walk. Man.
Would the jets turn back if he crossed the U.S. border, or would they just still follow him and like, oh, we got him before he crossed?
I don't know. I'm sure they'd talk to the Mexican authority or whatever.
Yeah,
but
I guess they could.
I know I took up a lot of time, but this was the only one I researched, and I didn't even scratch the surface of all the interesting little suspects and pieces of evidence that are involved with this case.
That's
it's
like one we
crazy.
could do a whole episode probably off of that.
Yeah.
Which maybe in the future.
True.
Never know. Maybe we'll revisit DB Cooper, but I want to hear more about people eating their lovers and living in the walls of houses.
Firstly, I'm actually going to skip down one. I want to cover this one so bad. This was the one that I just remember hearing this story when I was a kid, and like everyone's heard it. It's one of the most iconic names. It's been made into a 1979 movie, a 2005 movie with Ryan Reynolds. The Amityville Horror.
Free Guy?
Yeah. Free Guy. Sorry. The Amityville Horror. And it was at the beginning of The Conjuring 3, the not as good Conjuring movie. So everyone's heard of this. Do you guys know the real story of the Amityville Horror outside of like the movies and stuff?
No.
Not outside of the movies, no.
Yeah, I feel like it's something everyone knows, but like few people have actually looked into the real story, and it's pretty wild.
Well, the movie said it was based on a true story.
Yes, technically the Amityville Horror, there's two sets of families that lived in this house, and the movie's about the second set.
Okay.
The second family that lived there. So I'm going to cover both real quick. So 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, which is 30 minutes from downtown New York, would become the place of nightmares. November 13th, 1974, the house was the scene of mass murder.
So this was only like 3 years after D.B. Cooper died in the woods.
We're back in the 70s. Wild. Wild time.
It's 13 DC. I guess it would be.
Suddenly,
Right, yes,
a
yeah.
man comes out of the
TBC.
sky wearing a backpack. So, the DeFeo family, which had the parents of Ronald DeFeo Sr., his wife Louise, children Mark, John, Allison, Don, and there's Ronald Jr., lived there. And they had a dark secret. The family had a black sheep. So, Ronald DeFeo Jr. commonly had fights with his family, especially his dad. And after a particularly bad one, Ronnie DeFeo went to a bar and he was kind of hanging out around town, and he enters his family home just after 3 a.m. carrying a .35 caliber lever-action Marlin rifle. Ronald Jr. crept upstairs into his 43-year-old parents' bedroom. As his parents slept peacefully, he raised his rifle and shot each of them where they lay. Big Ronald Sr. was critically injured but struggled to his feet and attempted to fight his attacker. Jr. finished him off with another point-blank shot, then turned to his mother, who lay moaning in the bed, wounded and bleeding, and ended her life with a second bullet. Jr. next turned his attention to his younger siblings. He entered the room of his youngest brother, 12-year-old Mark, and 9-year-old John, where the two boys must have been laying in terror in their beds after hearing this commotion. He ordered the two boys to lay face down in their beds before he shot them point-blank in the back and left them to die. He entered the room with his 13-year-old sister, Allison. She turned her head to look at him, and he shot the young girl in the face, bullet through her left cheek, exiting through her right ear, killing her instantly. Last, he entered the room of his oldest 18-year-old sister, Dawn, pressed the barrel of his gun against the back of her head, and fired, killing her instantly. He quickly discarded this evidence, including his bloody clothes, the rifle, bullets, and calmly took a bath, where his family was dead in this house. So, he changed his clothes, went to work the next morning, as usual, and the very same day, around 6 p.m., Junior turned up at a local bar where he was a regular and shouted, "I think my mother and father are shot." So a group of men went with him to his parents' house. Yeah, what a douche.
Classic.
Yeah.
Classic.
It's
So-
like in the hot dog outfit.
Yeah,
It's
right,
like,
yeah.
guys, help.
We're all wondering who did this. Yeah.
So a group of men with him went to his parents' home nearby, where they found the bodies of his family and siblings. His parents face down, shot to death, and covered in their own blood. Police arrived, naturally questioned Ronald Jr. His story started to fall apart when he didn't have any alibi, and investigators noticed significant holes in his story, including his own whereabouts. He broke down and confessed to having ruthlessly murdered his entire family, telling investigators, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop." Now, that is not where this story ends. The house sat vacant for 13 months until a new family, the Lutz family, purchased the home at a very low price of $80,000. This is like a $500,000 home. So they knew about these murders ahead of time. when they moved
That is
into
the
this
ultimate
house.
question, not to derail it, but like, if you had a swanky, let's just say mansion, but there was a mass murder in there.
I literally wrote that as a question at the end.
Yeah.
Of this.
Yeah,
Would you-
just like, would you?
So we'll talk about that at the end. So this is actually where the movies pick up. They always skip over that first story, and they just pick up with the Lutz family. So they going on record saying that this house is riddled with paranormal activity. George Lutz, the father, would wake up at 3:15 a.m. every morning, which was about the same time the murders happened. The family claimed to smell strange odors such as rotting meat and death, and green slime would ooze out of the walls. That sounds like the Ashley.
SpongeBob, yeah.
I was thinking that
The
too.
walls would ooze green slime.
Oh no, they always do that.
There would be random cold spots throughout the house where the temperature would just drop. A priest came by at one point to bless the house and claims he heard a voice scream to get the hell out, and the Lutzes never slept in that room again. Other less believable activity that was reported was spirits knocking down knives in the kitchen, and George claimed he saw a pig-like creature with glaring red eyes looking at him. He was outside looking in the top window.
The Enfield monster.
Yeah, was also in
The
Amityville.
kangaroo.
George's wife's Kathy also supposedly levitated off the bed. In their investigations, George and Kathy this was a famous thing. They took a lie detector test after they moved out of the house, and they passed the lie detector test. That they said there was no significant evidence that they were lying when they asked them about.
I do know that those things aren't foolproof, though.
Yeah, I mean it's not, but to be able to pass every single thing on that is pretty interesting.
Not nothing.
Right.
So, during an interview with the murderer, Ronald Jr., he stated that he heard these voices when he lived in this house and they urged him to kill his family. So, the house has officially been sold as of February 2017 to an undisclosed owner for around $600,000, and the address has been changed to kind of keep people away. So, supposedly, George has watched these movies and claimed that they are like mostly true to what happened. So, do you think this is possible or not? Do you think if you got like a cheap house that murders were into it, would you fool yourself into experiencing paranormal activity? And it seems like an easy out for Ron Jr. to say, yeah, the house is haunted. That's why I killed my family.
Yeah, I think it's 100%. Like it depends on if you know that happened. I'd be curious to know if they found out about those murders, because I assume that's why it was so cheap. Like,
yeah, they said they knew it ahead of time,
Okay.
and that's why the house was, because it was like close to New York City, and it's like a 5-bedroom, like 3-story, 3-bathroom, like big house.
Dude, I don't care if that's $100. You can't sleep comfortably in there, because you know what? What's funny, personal experience. Whenever we filmed the last Pretty Creepy, and I was driving home at night, I could have sworn like 10 different times some fucking thing was jumping out of the thing in front of my car.
Yeah.
So I think whenever you're on edge like that and you're thinking, okay, this is where this happened, your mind fills in the blanks.
We talked about this on the last episode where, what makes a lot of these hard to tell is that, because even them passing a lie detector test, maybe they did see something there. They thought they saw.
That's
something.
what-
You
what
can
I-
see something clear as day, but
Yeah.
that's why proof is physical evidence is important,
Because if you're in there and you know this massacre happened, you're sitting there and you're just looking into the shadows and you're seeing things. It's like, because if you were at your house, like let's say he saw a pig right in the backyard. If you were at your house and you walked outside and you saw a pig walking around, you'd be like, well, that's odd.
Yeah.
What is he doing?
Well, he was
here?
like in the yard, and he saw it in the upstairs window, looking like out the window at him.
Oh,
Like it was in the house.
dude, that
looking
gave
out
me
at
chills. That's
right?
so.
took a dead pig
I will
and plopped it on the table.
I will say to Craig, I made this this was not when I was doing this research, because I've researched this heavily in my past before too, but I've made the same mistake you did before. There was a documentary about the Amityville Horror, and it had that warning in the front of it, and I was like, oh, it's just a doc. They show there's the real photos of the DeFeo family in their beds, like dead, and they showed it in this documentary. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like,
that's
because I
messed
guess
up.
crime
here's
scene photos can be released to like the
thing.
public.
If you believe, sorry.
Those pictures were haunting, by the way.
If you believe that there is some kind of afterlife or sort of demonic realm, I don't know what else you'd call it, maybe this is like a point, like a convergence point where demons are haunting this place or ghosts are haunting this place, and it is messing with people. It's just sometimes, for me, always, even though that might be more entertaining to believe or certainly better for a movie, because I like those Conjuring movies, because like in them the ghosts are real and the Warrens are like superheroes.
You kind of got to get into it a little bit, but it's the real story in this one that gets me too.
turning the other side and just saying, is it more likely that this is a convergence point where like otherworldly spirits are living there and malign forces are manipulating events in that house? Or is it just this kid snapped, killed his whole family? I mean, we have people nowadays who unfortunately do horrible shooting sprees or whatever that are incomprehensible to think about, but people do them. And also a family moving in there afterward, knowing about this horrible stuff. Is it more likely that they just experienced a sort of like paranoia or fear? You know, I don't know them personally, so I'm not going to really call anybody a liar, because they might have even thought they saw something. But that's where I always stand with this stuff, is like, what's more believable? What's more likely? But that doesn't necessarily mean that the more likely thing is always true, you know?
Yeah. What's just always got me about this story is the blend of hard, real evidence. There was a murder at this house.
Yeah.
And then it kind of gets blended with the paranormal, which, you know, can be a little bit questionable sometimes. The most terrifying thing from this entire story is Ronald Jr.'s quote where he says, "Once I started, I couldn't stop."
Yeah.
That is terror. That's like bone chilling, like a phrase for just a murderer to say. And what do you guys think? Would you be able to move into a house knowing? Do you know what would be even weirder is if you moved into a house and learned afterwards that there was a murder there? Like you've been living in this house for years and you come across a news article one day.
That would be interesting. I mean, it would depend. Like, I don't know. I might not buy a house because
what if it's
someone
a good deal?
was shot there or something.
Dude, that kind of happened to me. Whenever we lived in our first apartment, it was in not the best area.
Yeah.
And I remember in one of my classes, we were reading this news report about this dude who he had his girlfriend or ex-girlfriend had a restraining order against him. He broke that, like took her home and like viciously like cut her throat, and there was all this blood like everywhere, and they had to clean it up. And I'm reading this and looking at where it is. It's fucking across the street from our apartment. And I was like, I'm in my class, I was freaking out. I'm like, this is fucking across the street from where I live. So not the house, but still kind of.
To answer your question though, Lucas, if I knew like a son murdered his whole family there, I probably wouldn't. Like, that's just
dark.
It's just
That's
one of those things.
It doesn't
where
matter how much it is, how nice the house is. You can't.
I just don't want to tempt fate.
Yeah.
Because I am going to be that person sitting, even if there's nothing abnormal there or paranormal, I am going to be sitting in my bed thinking about that some nights. Like, should I
this
have,
wall was the last thing
like,
somebody saw.
should I have a kid?
Yeah.
You know, like,
What
are
would
they going to
also,
kill
like,
me?
That guy was still alive. Like I'd have that thought in my head. Like, what if he gets out of jail and wants to come back to this house? Like he just shows up in the middle of the night, like after he breaks out of jail or something. Like that's what I would think.
We should
about
make that movie.
Yeah.
Trademark. Don't, you know, Aaron Sorkin, if I see you write that fucking movie, I'm coming for your ass.
All right, Craig, take us into the guy who was apparently worse than the cannibal.
Yeah. We don't have a ton of time left, but I'll be brief. I won't say this lightly. I will put a trigger warning in front of this just because it's that upsetting. I think this is probably the most like upsetting true crime thing that I've ever heard of, and it's pretty notorious. I did not see photos, thank God, like the other one, but it's still very upsetting. So take that for what you will. It is the murder of Junko Furuta. So Junko was a Japanese high school girl who was living a perfectly normal life. She attended high school, had a part-time job, and was saving up for a graduation trip at the end of the school year. She was well-liked, had high grades, and was very popular. On November 25th, 1988, still the 80s.
Golden era.
Yeah. Junko left high school and went to work, looking forward to catching the final episode of her favorite TV show that night. On her bike ride home from work, someone kicked Junko off her bike and ran off. A young man approached her as a witness to the attack and offered to walk her home safely. And as it turns out, the man who attacked her and this witness were working together. So he eventually, kidnapped her and assaulted her and a warehouse, and in a hotel room. And then that man, I say man, but they were like high school actually. So they were like probably like 17-year-old. So I guess I'll say boy. So man, boy, whatever. Then that boy called two of his friends bragging about what he had done. And this group of kids were low-ranking Yakuza and had a history of sex crimes already. And eventually the other boys came over and joined the attacker in a park. And by going through her notebook, they found out where she lived and said that if she told anybody or tried to escape, they would, murder her family. Yakuza would come and, kill her whole family. So they took her to one of the boys' parents' house and they all assaulted her there. She remained there captive for weeks. So Junko's parents, a few days after she went missing, reported her missing. But the boys forced her to call her parents, saying that she was fine and to call off the investigation. Around the boy's parents, who still lived there, she pretended like she was his girlfriend. And the parents were scared to intervene since their son had already become violent with them. So they probably knew something was going on, but they just...
Now he's going to kick my butt.
Yeah, basically.
Well, they probably knew he was like crime world.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it gets just even crazier from there to the point where it's almost comedic how like fucked up. And I hope it's not true, but I'm pretty sure it is. Yeah. So then eventually the son invited two more boys, 6 boys total now, to the house to assault her. And it put her into such a state of shock that she became unconscious and was staring at the ceiling without blinking, just like totally like out of body because all this stuff was going on. And in total, she was held captive for 40 days. And according to testimony, she had been assaulted more than 500 times by more than 100 men and boys. And then one day she was assaulted by 12 people in one day. Some of the stuff that they made her do is they forced her to shave her pubic hair, dance naked for them, and masturbate in front of them. And they inserted all kinds of objects into her, including a lit match, a metal rod, and a glass bottle. And they also repeatedly burned her legs and arms with lighter fluid. And by the end of her torture, she was severely malnourished and was only given milk to drink. And she was so weak she couldn't even take herself to the toilet. Her appearance became deformed after the attacks, and her face was so swollen that she was unrecognizable. She started to give off a rotting smell, and so the group stopped being sexually interested in her, and they consequently assaulted another girl. I don't think they captured her like she did, like they did Junko, but, they moved on, sort of.
Jesus.
And then on January 4th, 1989, one of the boys lost a game of Mahjong and decided to take out his anger on Junko by torturing her for 2 hours. So he poured lighter fluid on her body and set it on fire, and she tried to put it out, but started to become unresponsive. They all joined in and kept punching her, and eventually they dropped hot wax on her face, placed 2 candles on her eyelids, and forced her to drink her own pee.
What the fuck?
Since she was bleeding so badly, pus started coming out of her infected burns. So the boys put their hands in plastic bags so they could continue beating her and not get the pus on their hands. They then dropped an iron exercise ball onto her stomach over and over, and then eventually she succumbed to her wounds and died. Her body was discovered by one of the boys' brothers, and he's told him that he's got to get rid of it to cover it up. They wrapped the body in blankets and put her in a travel bag. They put that bag into an oil drum and filled it with wet concrete and disposed of it on a cement truck. And as part of her burial, during the capture, Junko said how she regretted not being able to watch that favorite finale, or the finale of her favorite TV show. So one of the boys put a videotape of the episode in the bag with her body. So not because he pitied her, but because he didn't want her to come back as a ghost and haunt him. So they were eventually captured by police, and they confessed, and they did recover her body and identify her via fingerprints. So in terms of the aftermath, obviously this was a huge story in Japan. Apparently, her parents tried to sit there, during like the trial, and I think the mom fainted a few times. Obviously, I don't blame her because of...
I would too. I almost did while you're telling it.
Yeah. While the boys' identities were initially classified since they were minors, journalists discovered their identities and published them, feeling that they didn't deserve anonymity. The longest sentence of the boys, I guess I should say, what do you think the longest sentence they got?
Since they're juveniles, it's going to be way too short. I'm going to say I was going to say 6.
Well, the one got 20 years, which is apparently the second longest besides life, I think, in Japan. And the other boys got less than 10 years, like between 4 and 6.
That's insane.
Yeah, I'm thinking they all should have gotten life.
Yeah.
Or like I don't advocate for the death penalty, but come on.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Something.
The old eye for an eye.
That
Yeah.
was there's making a mistake as a kid, but that's like sadistic and fucked up.
That's
Yeah.
bad. And then none of the boys, because there's some follow up with them, they haven't really displayed any remorse and continue their life of crime. One of the mothers of the boys reportedly vandalized her grave because they blamed her for ruining his life, her son's life, which is like, what a class act.
Yeah. Right.
Parents
But-
can be wild too.
Yeah. And last thing I'll say is there's a famous exploitation film. So if you see like one of those icebergs, that's one of the common ones, is this. Like it's like I think it's semi-banned. I think it's not real, but
Yeah. Does it just show like a bunch of torturing and
yeah.
Ugh.
So it's just one of those movies. So pretty famous case.
Sick.
But yeah,
I need to shower now.
Yeah,
I
right,
might
yeah.
Go,
Well, Craig, you're definitely capping us off with the freakiest one.
just to lighten the mood here for just a little quick segment. Have you guys had any like real life experiences? Any little?
Sure, but
I'll just lead us off with a little.
I'd like to save it for another show because we need to like wrap up here.
Oh yeah. I'll lead us off with just a little light quick story
Yeah.
here. So we have a church that's near us, and supposedly it's called Hanky Church,
Yes.
and there's a legend that there was a priest there, and he did kind of some bad stuff, and he ended up there's a big tree outside, and he got hung, and the church eventually got burned down. I don't know the entire story off the top of my head, but that's the gist of it. So this priest was hung on the big tree outside of this church. It's no longer there, and it's kind of an empty lot, and you could drive to. So when we were kids, especially in like high school and stuff, we would go up there at like 3 a.m. and wait around. And the only thing that we ever experienced, I walked up there by myself the one time. Everyone makes fun of me, but that is a true story. And our friend Dan drove us up there the one time, and he was so scared that he stayed in his car and locked the doors a mile down the road, and I had to ride on like the hood of his car.
Oh
to
my
it.
God, I was there for that.
Yeah,
I remember
and,
that. I forgot. I had
thing-
forgotten about that.
the things our friends have talked about from this place, some of us
It's like 10 years ago that
Yeah.
happened.
you can smell the burning church and some of our friends have claimed that they've smelled burning wood when you're up there, and it's like not near anything that's going to be burning wood, not near homes. And I was up there one time with, I don't remember who was there. It might have been RJ and our friend Adam. And we were standing out there, and we brought candles because we were being dumb.
Yeah.
And we had some candles, and off in the shadow down the road, all 3 of us heard footprints walking towards us. And then they stopped once, because you can gauge distance. They stopped once they got to the edge of the shadow where the street light turned on. We all 3 heard footprints that day.
Yikes.
And none of us got like freaked out or anything. We all kind of like, did you guys hear that? And we were fine. We got in the car and left. But that was a
But the,
real world experience.
in the moment, you're like, it's nothing. And then you think about it later on, and you're like, what the fuck happened?
Well, I'll get into some more stories on a future podcast.
Yeah,
but
I
like
think
to,
we should.
I like to push the boundaries a lot. I like
when we have a
seeking
longer
it out
segment.
for a couple years, like trying to, because I wanted to experience, because I was like, I don't believe any of this stuff. I want to experience something to believe it. And so I have some good stories that we can get into at a future date.
All righty. Well, I think that does it for Pretty Creepy Podcast episode 2, right?
It does. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for sticking around. Thanks for, we got some support on the last one. We were hoping people would like hearing some creepy and scary stories. So we'll see you again. Maybe this series will continue going.
Yep. Stay creepy.
Stay
Stay
creepy.
creepy.